Chinese government buying our pines as well. How's your business plan growing pines? And it's all based around two government policies in two governments we don't trust. How's it a good business plan going forward?
Comes back to my original, one of my points before, you've got to have multiple products. So produce carbon and lumber. And don't just sell it to the Chinese, I mean, we all know that. So that's just about diversification of market. And if you actually bring that back to your farm, having diversified products off your farm is the way to be resilient to market. So that when beef's up, lamb's down. You know, trees are up, the beef's down, whatever. We need to harvest some trees because we've got no income from our stock. We've had to sell them because it's a drought. Well, we can harvest the trees. So it's about building a diversified, resilient business and not necessarily worrying about what China are doing, but trying to produce a resilient business through diversification.
Doesn't the hardwoods, for hardwoods, North America's king of it because of the alpine growing. Why are we going to think we're the king of that?
Well, we don't have to be the king of it. We just need to be building our own houses out of our own wood.
I forgot to ask, may I ask, isn't the world heading for more expensive food at a rate of knots with the climate change? Isn't climate change endangering the food supply? So if you're encouraging people to grow more trees, that's our food supply going down.
Well, answer me this. Do you know that 30% of the food we produce is wasted in the world? So how long do you think it's going to become when we're going to be short of food? It's going to be a long time before we teach everybody to look after and eat the food they've got on their plate.
Isn't climate change reducing the food supply?
Hard to say. I don't know.
I think there's some pretty complex questions here. And I think if we talk about food out of New Zealand, right? A lot of our sheep and beef hill country systems have, produced what is an amazing product. We never got to the grips for a long time actually how valuable that product is and how valuable what New Zealand does in terms of image to the rest of the world. We're seeing value increase in our red meat purely because I think we've learned and we've come much more together and collaboratively as a sector to actually identify our markets and create that value. So I disagree. I don't think that we're going to see the ups and downs in our protein like we used to see. We used to ship it as a commodity market. Now we're seeing much more opportunities to create value in our product. So this is I actually disagree. There's a fallacy around, hey, we've got to, we're going to start to see markets go up and down. And there is a big risk, I believe, in pines because the other part about pines is, or let's say blanket afforestation, is the risk of the fact that it's still a commodity market. So I agree, we need to look at different types of wood, how they're used in New Zealand. If we do the regulatory changes, I mean, we've all seen those who sit around or live around ports around New Zealand have seen boats backed up and China won't buy. It's a massive risk. The other risk is what regulatory changes might occur for harvesting pine trees going forward in the future as we learn more and more about the impact of those on the environment. So I think that there is a whole rethink that we've got to have, but I think we've also got to have real faith in what we do as a community and the products that we've done. And I mean, I have great faith in strong wool now, and that's purely because we're coming together as an industry in New Zealand to really look to create value for that in the future. So I actually agree we need to be really cognizant of what it might look like in 30 years' time and the real issues that could be created by, say, large areas of pine trees that might not be harvested because it might not be doable.
Oh, I've got a question for you, William. I see in your photos of your farm you had quite a lot of space planted poplars and willows and things like that. Yep. Are they considered under ETS? Can you use them?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Yes, a lot of our poplar areas are. We looked at registering those before we understood the direction of the government and He-Waki Kanoa. So this kind of goes to, at the moment we have the ETS operating, which could be an opportunity for us to record our sequestration and sell that on the open market. We're really concerned about what it might look like if there is a if we're asked to account for our actual on-farm emissions, and if we sold our credits into the ETS right now, we might actually have to buy those back at some time in the future. So our focus now is so that graph I put up before doesn't just refer to those trees which would qualify for the ETS. We had our entire farm survey that was actually part of the pilot program with Silverfern Farms, and understood all of the sequestration that was going on in our business, so we could understand, with this regulatory challenge that I think will evolve over time to be more favourable for our business, but at this point in time, are we going to be okay moving through it? And certainly for us, for a business, it looks like we will be, but we've got to be very careful what we register in the ETS and what we sell, as opposed to the challenges we might have coming forward in the near future.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that there is actually quite a range of products. So you might have seen there's a bit of news at the moment about biomass and using wood pellets for energy. So offsetting or replacing coal with wood products. So if these swathes of pine trees might end up in the furnace. 30 years is a long time, and so it's very hard to, it's impossible really, to understand what's going to happen in 30 years. So you can only really make decisions based on the best information you've got at the moment, and it should always come back to your land and the best value for your land, today, tomorrow, next year, 5 years, 10 years, and what you think about the future. So that's why it's important to integrate, or we believe anyway, integrate forestry into the business rather than waiting until you come to a point. I mean, some of these farms have been sold to carbon forestry because there's no other buyer is able to sell them or pay the price. And so when you as a farmer are selling your land, that's the only your income. So you've got option's choice. You can sell it to a sheep and beef farmer who might pay 10 or 20%, 30% less, or you can sell it to New Zealand carbon farming. What are you going to do? You're going to worry about New Zealand, communities, and sell it to the sheep and beef farmer. We're going to say, well, actually, I've got to worry about myself and my family. I'm going to sell it to them. Now, the way to become resilient about that is to have a higher value farm that is going to be more desirable in the market. So you're less prone to those takeovers, and that's what William talked a little bit about before this session, was that sheep and beef farms, the sales have tailed off because sheep and beef markets are slightly better now than they were 3 years ago, and so farmers are less at risk to those takeovers. But I'm not sure they have the same faith that William does in terms of the ups and downs of the market. Because we had this discussion 30 years ago when we were at university. The chief guys need to get together and not sell land as a commodity. So these things take time. But being more resilient as a business owner to those takeovers is the key. Succession plan, that's what you need. You want to make sure the business stays as a sheep and beef operation.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the really positive side of it and the diversification, because that's on farm, it's really, really good. Just had a couple of questions. This is more in relation to New Zealand carbon farm that I just don't quite understand. And one of those, is it correct that they can only get the carbon credits for 40 years? Is that correct?
Not quite.
And how does that work?
It's 50 years.
So Jeanette's just asking, is the New Zealand carbon farm can only get the carbon credit for 40 years?
I was at a presentation in Hamilton yesterday by Craig's investment partners, and they talked about them only being able to get those carbon credits for 40 years, and then they would walk away and find other land so that they could then get more carbon credits. Is that correct?
No.
Because these are trees, this is permanent forestry that we're not going to harvest.
So the current look-up tables go to 50 years. So that's the current limit to the carbon that can be sequestered, claimed and sold. Currently. But remember, the point's been made that it's a 50-year plan the government has, the trees don't actually stop growing for 50 years. So, not normally 50 years, but that's, where you come into those other species which don't fall over, like they're less prone to anyway. So, so 50 years is the limit currently under the current lookup tables, but with carbon farming they actually use a different system. They want areas that are bigger than 100 hectares, and if they get into 100 hectares, then they have to use what's called the forest measurement approach, and so therefore they create their own lookup tables and measure their own growth, and so they'll still probably only go up to 50 years currently, but if there's regulatory will, then those tables will be extended, because the trees won't stop growing.
So are they selling carbon 50 years out now?
Or I don't know, you can ask them.
Is that how it works?
Not necessarily, but they can contract, and that's why they'll sort of stay
I'm
in
pretty
business.
sure they said, because the reason we ask is that we've got 1,300 hectares neighbouring us that is being planted by NZ carbon farming at how many students per hectare?
1,300.
And this is above us. We cannot understand how that land is going to cope with that. They've said that it's only going to be 40 years, and then they're going to walk away. So we, I sort of don't understand how that works. They're going to go somewhere else and take up some more
And you
land.
have to take that up to them.
But the other thing I don't understand either, and maybe you can explain, is if you're using trees to suppress carbon, how does burning the carbon as burning the wood as biomass not re-release that carbon?
Well, it does, but it's a cycle. So it's a bit like a methane cycle that we all know and love. Carbon, is sequestered by the grass and then gets eaten by ruminants and is belched out as methane. So, but that turns into CO2. So there's a cycle. It's the same with trees. So I guess the advantage of it is it's not like coal, which is burned and then released into the atmosphere and stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. And coal takes millions of years. So the cycle for coal is millions of years. The cycle for a pine tree is 28. So it's a cycle. It's not adding or taking from the carbon emissions in the air, whereas coal is always adding.
I think what you're pointing out though is that carbon farming and purchasing that carbon, planting it out, is subject to basically no regulation, right? You can do whatever you want. And so therefore, because it's not going to be harvested, really if it has effects on neighbouring properties or things like that, which is considered every other activity, it's not included at this point in time, which is a real frustration. I mean, basically this is hey, we've got a problem, we'll whack in a solution here, and it's been around for a long time, but it's just coming into real effect now. And that's a real challenge, is actually, one is talking through and making government and regulators realise that there is this massive problem if you continue down this path, right, of destruction of communities, massive environmental impacts, and long-term issues. Two is, well, what is the solution? Because, I mean, you're then going to, do we change the ETS and the regulations? Do we cap the amount? What is the implications if you do that? You have a market that's going great guns, it's rocking on.
I think the solution is what you gentlemen have been talking about. The right tree in the right place and part of the farm.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Just a question and a compliment to you, Gary. I have to say thank you for what you're doing and trying to get the other regional councils and district councils in on this discussion. I guess my question is part of your debate, because you mentioned it, right tree, right place, taking into account that particularly pines radiata and eucalyptus are both adiabatic and hydrophobic. So they actually dry out the soil and they do carbon strip the soil. And so effectively what they do is they increase the temperature of the land. And that explains why we have these fires in Australia, we have them in California. And the push has been pines radiata because it's been a fast growing tree, and yeah, sure, perhaps 3 times the amount of carbon, but it also strips the soil. So there's part of that discussion in there, Gary, because I think it's a really crucial one for New Zealand.
There's, it's trying to make sure, I think some of the discussion around those other varieties is an important one, and trying to find something that gets close to competing, I suppose, with how quickly it's sequenced. That's the challenge. There's a number of discussions running along in this, and it's really trying to make sure that people do have options. It certainly is about not planting out whole farms. It's trying to keep away from that. New Zealand carbon farming will tell you that's really helpful for natives to come up through it. But most people have been in the pine forest. There's not a hell of a lot underneath the trees. So we don't have a lot of faith in what they say here. But it's, these guys are probably better positioned to answer what the right trees are. We're just trying to say, look, it can't carry on. It's not sustainable for communities to carry on the way it is. And we're having very special environmental areas being damaged, possibly destroyed, in the name of saving the environment. So there's just, it's a problem with what's happening now. The smarter people than me around who can actually come up with the answers around that. But we're just saying, hey, look, you need to get thinking about this. You need to actually take some action to control what's happening, stop what's happening, the way it's happening, and actually make it work better for everybody. So, I'm really encouraged with what's been said here tonight. There's some really good work going on.
So can I just come in there? So to me, the science is wrong, and I see you engaging there, William, and maybe you've got a comment. But if we were to plant uru trees, they actually increase the soil sequestration as well, and they attract, because they're hygroscopic. They attract moisture and they grow the undergrowth. Pines don't. And so, to me, we need to really push the right tree in the right place for environmental reasons as well as carbon sequestration.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I mean, I'm no expert in this area by any stretch of the imagination, but from what I understand is that there is issues around water being drawn out of the system through pine trees. We've got a big focus now on our farm looking at how we can protect our wetlands, but use them as sinks to capture nutrient as they run off. The idea of green funds, and the government's trying to get us regulate capturing wetlands. And I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe if we just really promote for farmers to think about how that can create a real advantage in their business, then create an opportunity rather than a hindrance, then that might be the better way to go. And then I look over the hill and I see farms being bought for carbon forestry, and everything on the chickpea farm is planted out, including wetlands. There's no regulation around it, nobody's monitoring it, and it's a real frustration. So, but we've got to keep, we're trying to have these conversations, but keep having these conversations and talk about what are the negative aspects and what are the great opportunities.
One of the things, talking about Hazeldean, 2,500 hectare farms has been brought up. A lot of that's basically got snow tusks. There's a lot of the plant is actually under the ground, and so it is one that the farmers will do the regular burn-offs and so on to actually bring back the top part of the plant and allow more pasture to grow around it. But the reality is that you won't kill them by burning them because there's so much under the ground. I don't know whether that's able to be taken into sequestration side of things. There's a fair bit of carbon popped up there. And in a good fog, they'll actually draw a lot of moisture out of the air and pull it into the ground, as opposed to pine trees, which is basically creates a
Unfortunately, I'm not a specialist in water relationships and trees. Whereas my business partner, he's more into this sort of thing. But the current ETS is really based on a change of land use from pasture to forestry. And And so there's a fundamental change in the carbon to a limit. And so it's not trying to compare the understory or the carbon stored under a native or a cypress or a pine. There are tables for that, but it's it's very much around the change in land use.
Just a quick question I've been asked. What are the risks of having an ETS block of trees, and if they're damaged by wind or fire before or during that cycle?
And they're in the ETS.
Yes.
So the ETS has been recently revised so that as long as those trees are replanted, then you don't get paying for those emissions. You have to wait for those trees to get back to the same point they were in before the wind fell them or the fire went through them. And you've got to undertake to keep forestry on that site, but there's no penalty for that, which is a new thing. There used to be insurance for fire and wind damage because of ETS emissions. So the government's taking sort of a countrywide view that on average those risks are manageable. It's something like 0.03% of the plantation area of fire and wind. So I've managed the risk in that way.
What area does a forest sequester from? Like, are we farmed in 10 country, is that sequestering carbon from Northland, or from the South Island, or from Australia, or? I mean,
It depends which way the wind's blowing.
yeah, so it's just, so it wants to be spread right across the country.
So this is a numbers game when you're talking about the ETS carbon sequestration, right? And it's how they do the calculations both internationally to meet our Paris Accord requirements, and it's how the government sets out the accounting system in New Zealand, right? It doesn't relate to actually, without being, the science is a bit different, let's say. So when you're, you might think that that's a bit of a silly question, saying, oh, well, what carbon are we sequestering? But there's recently been work done, I think it's by NIWA, has done a paper, and they've been looking at the balance of greenhouse gases above certain areas in New Zealand, right? And hello, they've kind of found out that, there's significant amount of emissions over cities, and there's not over the rural areas. And they're actually finding that there's significant sequestration going on in Fiordland. I can't explain why, because that should be a stable process. But so then that starts the big question is that, if you're looking at a place like New Zealand, why...
Which is a maritime nation, covered in oceans, which are the best sequesters of the lot.
Yeah. So the question is how are we going to solve this problem by actually taking our valued land use out? It just starts to, when you start to look at it like that, it asks some pretty big questions. And as I said, that's just starting to come out now. And how that'll evolve, I don't know.
Two questions, Keith and Jared.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Question to you, John, was, and it's just trying to get, like the rest of the time, to get our heads around. So to get the carbon credits and to start to get the income from it, my understanding is that it is based on you have to have a canopy cover to achieve that. So you can't have individual trees like in a dairy or sheep farm situation as a shelter tree. Does it require a canopy cover to get it, or can this is a better way to farmers can we go for a biomass measurement to get that carbon credit? Because I can't see any difference.
Well, the current rules, if you like, are that whatever the area needs to be at least 1 hectare to be registered in the ETS, it needs to be an average of 30 metres wide, and you can't have gaps bigger than 15 metres by 15 metres. So, and shelter belts and orchards are out inside the ETS. And so it's always been a bone of contention, but it comes back to that numbers game, as we've heard. You know, there's actually quite a lot of cost associated with doing that measurement of individual trees that the government just doesn't see enough return for that in terms of the cost that they have to engage to be able to then prove that to the rest of the world. So they deal in bigger parcels, if you like, for that reason. But it is something that New Zealand could do under a regulatory type arrangement. We talked about, you know, maybe there's some additional benefits, biodiversity, next cab off the rank for the government. If there was some credibility or some income available by increasing the biodiversity on your farm for the good of New Zealand, and you get a monetary return, then that's going to have an impact on the farm. You're going to be more likely to do that. So, but there's no reason you couldn't do that with the New Zealand regulatory framework. But you wouldn't be able to then necessarily get that credit overseas. Although, having said that, there are businesses that do that in New Zealand. There are businesses that sell special carbon, native carbon from native trees, at a premium to some buyers. It's quite a specialised market. It's outside. I'm not sure if it's outside the ETS, but essentially, I think they still use the ETS rules to sort of manage that. So we'll still have to have those requirements to be more than hectare, more than 30 metres wide. So and that's an average of 30 metres. So you can, if you are being a little bit clever, potentially have an area, plant a blob, if you like, at the end of the shelter belt that might be 2 or 3 trees wide or riparian to get that whole area included. There are little sort of supplements you can. The other thing that I think could be quite handy is actually the supply chain sort of approach, so that current legislation assumes that the tree is essentially burnt as it's been chopped down. And of course, that's not quite the case, because some of the wood gets made into houses, furniture, some of it goes into toilet paper. But if there was an appreciation or credit for the longer term storage of wood products, that will also add value to some of these other species.
Particularly houses where you're supposed to be building houses that are going to last at least 50 years, so building out of that.
Yeah, there's a bit of speculation and concern over what happens to mature pine forests. Is there any hard science of what happens 50, 80, 100 years out to those plantations?
I couldn't actually answer that, but there are 100-year-old pine trees.
Usually singular or in a shelter.
I think it was fine that those just regenerate. Trees coming down, and they'll see new ones and they'll come up.
And you will get that native regen underneath. So
1,300 stems a hectare?
Eventually, there won't be 1,300 stems. There'll be 600 stems, and there'll be 400 stems, and there'll be 100 stems, and the rest of it will be native. But none of us will be alive to see it. Yeah, long term.
I mean, because the other part of that is if you've got pests and pest control, the natives will have a hard time getting started.
1,300 trees per hectare is a carbon regime, maximising carbon and minimising cost. That's the business that they're in. So, farmers are sort of always, land managers are always concerned with the government interfering with valid business. So you're going to get pushback from these guys, because they think what they're doing is, that's their business. So it's free will is this.
What's the number of stems in the checks on that 350, isn't it?
Eventual, around about 300 years. You plant around 800, thin down to 300 in years.
So a lot of weight on the country.
Last question, John, up there.
Yes, this afternoon we had a presentation from Mike Dodds from Ag Research and Andrew Hughes from NIWA about what the research they did at Kuiti since it's been taken over out of the research system into a farming model. Half of it's been harvested pines. But I guess what concerned me about the research out of that was how little we know about the environmental impacts of pine forests, whether it's soil carbon sequestration, nitrogen discharges, and just general environmental impacts. So, we're seeing a huge amount of money being put into the Building Tree program and government funding into cleaning waterways, but very little research is going into, by NEWA's own admission, but Henry had research about going into just finding out what is happening under these pine trees. And so from Federated Farmers' point, I'll just ask William, and what do you think? Do you think that's a very strong point you were there today to lobby government to spend more money on research?
Yeah, listen, it's a really good question. So, government works in effectively 3-year cycles, and when you're looking at the current challenges in front of the current government, they're wanting to resolve some problems, right? And they don't often like people pointing out the fact that there's issues that are associated with the problems that they're trying to solve. And we're farmers, we've got to be, we've got to really understand that whilst we, I suppose, see what's going on in our communities and are concerned about what's going on in our communities, there is literally millions of other voters outside of us who have perhaps a different view of the world. And if the government wants to get re-elected, they're constantly focusing on that. So for us, it is constantly trying to stay in the room, tell the story, get better information. And one thing I learned today is I don't think we've actually got, I agree, we've not got the right research going on. And that's one thing that we can definitely go back and actually look at better is how do we promote not only the more research, but actually the research that's there and actually deliver it better to government to try and get people to say stop and think. And, for example, James Shaw, he does listen if you get a chance to actually get in there. It's about getting that chance and getting that opportunity. So, yes, from what I've heard today, it's a great opportunity for us to go back and have those conversations further. We've just got to continue to push those conversations, make sure we're working with other industry bodies, and try and get better outcomes. Because, we have to realise that there are lots of other groups out there who have got a larger voter base actually putting pressure on the government, and we've kind of got to understand that. How do we get ourselves into that right space? It's hard, it's really, really hard work. Ask a man just sitting over there, he's talking. Look at his hair, it's gone.
Right, we're sort of getting on. We are going to have some supper. We're not going to lock the doors, but they won't be running away. So if you've got more questions, I'm sure we're going to hang around and ask. I'll just hand over the last word for Jackie Harney, our wife for our president.
Okay, so I'd just like to thank very much for our speakers coming out. They've come a long way and they've done it out of the goodness of their hearts to speak to us tonight. And I just would like to recognise also that there's a couple of people that couldn't be here today, and that is Keith Eichen, Chair of Manitoba Trust Board, and Carl Barnes, who I met
a chat, ask some questions, yeah, talk to policy staff and also anyone else. Very good, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of